Thank you very much. It's a long time since I last spoke here, and the arcane rituals are as strange as ever, but I will try to fit in. First, let us be clear that the proposition which is being voted on is not the same as the arguments which the opposition says that we are using. Please listen to our arguments rather than the one we are alleged to have. And also let us make the proposition clear. The idea is not that this is a good idea or a good way to get organs. It's not that we should have a free market. It's nothing of the kind. It's just that the prohibition of organ selling, which began as soon as it was first heard that people were doing it, is actually a moral and intellectual mistake in the specific sense that starting from that position is incompatible with most of our normal views, and that the arguments fail because they try to show them as compatible with our normal views, the prohibition, whereas in fact it's completely opposed. So I am merely taking the minimal position that the absolute prohibition is unjustified, and that until we can free our minds from that, we can't even start addressing the question of what kinds of regulation and control there should be. The remarkable thing about the prohibition of organ selling when it started was its instantaneousness. I believe it was the objection in Britain was passed even more quickly than the Dangerous Dogs Act, which is saying something. It was instantaneous. Now, its being instantaneous means that there was no chance to think through the issues clearly and debate them. It meant that there was no possibility of collecting evidence to put on each side. There was no balancing of good and harm. It was an immediate emotional reaction that this is terrible, the greedy rich and the exploited poor. And we heard, the reason it came to light, was that some Turkish peasants had come to Harley Street to sell their organs to rich purchasers. This was the first time anyone had heard about it, and we were all horrified. But look at the thing from a different point of view. Transplantation of kidneys, and it's kidneys we're talking about mainly here, had by then become so successful that doctors were willing to do it, and you don't have surgeons going ahead operating if they're expecting a string of dead donors on their slabs. They were doing it, they were willing. The law had even accepted, de facto, I'm not sure how officially, that the good to be got from an organ transplant was great enough to justify the minimal risk to the donor. The donor had to give consent, but if the donor gave fully informed consent, that was all that was required. Now, what is ours to give is normally ours to sell. And without anybody doing anything, nobody putting up a policy saying organs should be sold, you can see that naturally, where some people have goods that other people desperately want, a market develops quite spontaneously. There is no nefarious planning in the back of this. And of course, if people have these exchanges they want to make, inevitably, just as in all areas of commerce, you will get facilitators and intermediaries. So this is just something which nobody had any reason to believe was wrong, no reason to think there was any reason to object to it, which was precisely why a special law had to be made to make it illegal, because there was no rational basis for making it illegal to start with. This immediacy is also a warning light to people who are involved with moral philosophy, because we all know that people who have passionate feelings and go by their moral intuitions are very difficult to shift by reason. As John Stuart Mill said, the more effectively you argue against these positions, the more people are convinced that their position has some deeper root that argument can't reach. And while the feeling remains, they are forever bringing up fresh entrenchments of argument to repair any breach made in the old. And modern psychologists have found exactly the same thing. So, you cannot go by your emotions and intuitions. Apart from anything else, you don't think much of other people's opposing emotions and intuitions. Their emotions and strong intuitions are prejudice and bigotry. And furthermore, we all know how strong the feelings used to be. Well, let's just take homosexuality. Go back a generation, the passionate disgust against homosexuality was impregnable by argument. And I think the same is happening with organ selling. Now go back to these people who came to Harley Street to buy and sell organs. We stopped them. We passed this legislation. One of these people probably was rich. Maybe he found some other way around it to get an organ, but if he didn't, he died. But the other one, the Turkish peasant had a daughter who was dying of leukemia. With leukemia, I don't know how far she was on. He had no money to pay for her treatment. There was none available in Turkey. He came to sell his kidney to try to save his daughter's life. So, while we were patting ourselves on the back for saving himself from exploitation, we presumably sent him home to watch his daughter die. Now, of course there are risks, of course there are dangers, but that's exactly why the black market is so disastrous. As long as there's only a black market, it means people who are desperate for money on one side and desperate for organs on the other will somehow or other get together, and we expose them to this terrible black market which has no controls. And this is why it's useless at the moment doing research among people in India who have come to harm, because all this research is against the background of a black market, and a black market is exactly what is causing the trouble. There are masses of stories of people done out of their promised money, not given proper medical attention, not being properly cared for. This is not an argument about autonomy or freedom of individuals. You could get the same conclusions out of paternalism. There are a lot of people who, with a properly regulated organ sale, could enormously improve their lives, and we ought to be trying to work out how. So really the conclusion of this is methodological. It isn't saying what kind of arrangement we ought to have. It's just saying that at the moment we have prohibited organ selling. We have prohibited it because we are disgusted by it. It was a quick reaction, remember, no research in the background. We prohibited it instantaneously. What does that prohibition do? It makes us, the rich and healthy, feel a bit more comfortable. And it does so at the expense of the very people we are supposed to be trying to help. So, we should get this great block out of our mind and start considering the question of how to adapt to this new medical procedure, because goodness knows, medicine is changing at such a speed and we are so far out of our depth that we just have to give up these intuitive reactions and start reasoning properly.